This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Ed Stafford with another session of Anatolian Dispatch. Today, our guest is Rich Outzen, who's been with us before. Rich is a retired colonel from the United States Army with extensive experience actually with Turkey and that region, and he is now a geopolitical consultant. And we're going to be talking today about a recent article that he published in the Washington Institute. It's one of their in-depth briefs. If you haven't been there, you should check those out. Just Google Washington Institute, Rich Outzen, and you will be able to get it. I believe it was July 9th it published.
That's right.
Okay, so for those people who haven't had the chance to read it yet, why don't you give us a little background about it and where you see things in the region?
Great. Thanks, Ed. And it's a great honor, as always, and a pleasure to be here with you, talking about things of interest to both of us. Well, so the Washington Institute was kind enough to publish the Drones, Deals, and National Will, Turkish Power Projection in the Coming Decade, which came together in my mind as a result of some thinking about what we saw last year in and around Turkey and how some people have interpreted it. I still sort of am amazed that we see analyses coming out of Washington predicated on the argument that Turkey is rogue, Turkey is ideologically extreme and executing a foreign policy based on ideological extremism, or my favorite, that Turkey is isolated. And because of their splendid isolation, therefore very vulnerable now to concerted action by the United States and its allies to clip the wings of this wayward beast. So I thought to myself, what can we learn from this very interesting year that we just saw in 2020? The point of departure was that 2020 really was a watershed in Turkish foreign policy. Why? Well, the traditional Turkish foreign policy in the period of the Republic has been fairly cautious and pragmatic. And by that, I mean the idea, Yurtta sulh, cihanda sulh, peace at home and peace in the world, was based on the terrible cataclysms that Turkey faced during the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the foundation of the Republic, and that it needed decades, literally, to rebuild its society internally and to strengthen its institutions. And not until several decades had passed and it was proximately threatened by the Soviet Union did they actually join a major alliance, NATO. And thereafter were very careful to follow a foreign policy that was multilateral in nature, with a couple of notable exceptions like Cyprus in 1974, and very much hewed to the multilateral lines chiseled out by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So even into the early post-Cold War, we saw that Turkey was very careful. They followed this zero problems with neighbors approach, which tried to apply a sort of idealistic multilateralism and to try to solve problems with Syria, with Iran, with the Russians, and so forth. But it found the region around it on fire as a result of its own restraint and the lack of restraint by some great powers. So you're Turkey, and all of a sudden your PKK problem is out of control, your Syria border is out of control, your Iraq border is out of control, Nagorno-Karabakh remains under what they see as Armenian occupation, and you become a little jaded as to the practice of multilateralism. The watershed came after several years of Turkey living through these very threatening experiences from its perspective and responding by developing some tools for power projection. And in 2020, we saw Turkey project hard power on multiple fronts. It fought not just Syrian Arab Army Assad forces, but Hezbollah-aligned militias, and reportedly even some revolutionary guards in Idlib, and stopped the offensive of the Assad regime into the last remaining bastion of opposition-held territory there. It also, in Libya, stopped a major offensive by Khalifa Haftar and the forces of the Libyan National Army, pushed them back to sort of the eastern half of the country, restoring the prospects for the survival of the government of national accord, and resetting the board for UN-led diplomacy. And then later in the year, of course, it had this experience of helping Azerbaijan regain Nagorno-Karabakh. So three different theaters with three dramatic applications of power projection. And by the way, a fourth running all year cross-border into Syria, to a smaller extent, and to a greater extent Iraq, in the operations Pençe Kaplan and Pençe Kartal against the PKK, which were very effective operations in terms of pushing PKK off the border area and inflicting. So this is almost unprecedented to have a mid-sized power, not in the context of a major war or multinational operations fight, for separate cross-border out-of-area operations. By the way, they were still active in Afghanistan this whole time.
Right.
So I thought to myself, this does not comport with the idea of a weak or an erratic or an isolated Turkey. So what's going on? That was the motive for the paper.
Well, I mean, let's peel apart a couple of those. I mean, one of the things you mentioned in the article, and you just mentioned 1974, which I will call the invasion of Cyprus. I mean, I know it's called the peace operation in Turkey, but from the more Western perspective, hold on, sorry about that. Make sure this person doesn't ever call again. Sorry about that.
Hope it wasn't your mom.
There's several reasons why we better hope that. But seriously, so back to 1974. In 1974, you mentioned in the article that what happened in Idlib last year with the loss of 34 Turkish soldiers was the largest loss that they had suffered since 1974. And yet they carried on with the operation. Because one of the things, this is not just Turkey, this is any country, any democracy in the world. And, it may be flawed, but Turkey is still a democracy. Democratic leaders care about casualties among their own troops. And, one of the big issues about the surge for George Bush was people had to convince him that, you know what, we do the surge, and what's going to happen is our casualties are going to go up initially, but we believe that then they're going to really plummet. And there's that famous Virginia, it was called, Lloyd Austin and others called it the Virginia graph, because it looked like the state of Virginia, which goes up and then like this. It happened to be right. So how do you interpret the fact that in the operation in Syria, in Idlib, Turkey suffers quickly a large number of casualties? I mean, 34 at one time, but yet continues the operation. How do you square that?
Well, Turkey has been described as a nation in arms. They still have mandatory military service, although it's been curtailed. But it's a country that in some ways is a thoroughly militarized society. If you go back far enough, as you and I are wont to do, into Turkish history, of course, when they were coming across from Eastern into Central and Southwest Asia, it was a nation in arms. It was not just the horseback warriors, but the entire society that would fight and move as an army. So that somehow permeated and stayed within Turkish social thought. I think the idea that the nation is an army, and this poses a different sort of a mindset, or conditions a different mindset than what we associate with the American mindset, certainly in terms of war. And by the way, this is fairly common in the rest of the Middle East as well, that the idea that we have peace, 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 war, 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 and that war is exceptional and peace is the norm, and therefore casualties in peacetime or absent a big war are not acceptable. That's not really the way the Middle East is. The Israelis think this way as well. It's war, peace, war, peace, war, peace. Turks have lost in helicopter crashes and in certain ambushes or terrorist attacks large numbers before. I think the big thing that makes a particular casualty unacceptable for Turks is the reason for which it is incurred. If, for instance, there were major casualties incurred in an operation in Afghanistan, it'd be a very different thing. But this is from the position of the Turks, is a national vital interest, either keeping a new flow of refugees coming from Idlib into Turkey, which there's so many Syrian refugees at all different parts of Turkey now that this is a visceral concern for much of the Turkish public. And in the case of the other parts of Syria, it's the PKK. So it's YPG, which the Turks see as indistinguishable for valid reasons from the PKK, and there is no upper bound in the number of battle casualties that the Turks would contemplate against the threat of the PKK, because they see it as an existential threat. And that's not just the government saying this is an existential threat. Socially, the revulsion against PKK terror and the belief that movement has at its root the eradication of the Turkish state, or certainly its division, means the Turks have a very high tolerance for casualties when it comes to the PKK. Syria is a proximate problem for them. Americans lose a dozen or so, 24 in Somalia. That's a far, far away place at which we have no proximate threat coming to us from. Right. Syria for Turkey could not be more different, and that's why I think that we saw, even though it's a gut punch to have the Russians, which we think it was, kill 34 Turks in a known and marked location to an airstrike. But they got, I think, to the extent that such things can be compensated for by a counterpunch, they got their counterpunches back in, and they killed large numbers of Assad forces and Hezbollah-aligned militias as well. Now, if the Turks took the gut punch and took another gut punch and took another gut punch, that would be something different. But it is in the nature of warfare that sometimes you take the gut punch, and as long as you achieve your political aim, right, a gut punch is acceptable.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I've looked at is that in those different operations that you just went through, the commitment of Turkish forces, Turkish regular forces, or their special forces or whatever, but I mean Turkish soldiers, okay? The commitment against the PKK, I agree with you, it's absolute. We don't have to worry about that. Idlib was kind of a questionable thing, and my personal view is that they handled it very wisely. They went after Assad's forces, they went after Hezbollah, they even probably did go after some Quds forces from Iran, but they didn't go after the Russians because they're not stupid. But then let's go over to Libya. In Libya, do you think that if they had gotten a really serious gut punch there, they would have stayed for the rest of the action? I mean, my own view is probably not, but at the same time, my perception is they were using proxies much more in Libya than they were in Syria.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with that. Now, it's true that there were at one point over 10,000 Turkish troops in Idlib, but still the frontline infantry forces for the most part were Syrian National Army and some of the other armed opposition groups. Now, but I take your point, the point that the margin for error in Syria was greater than it was in Libya. I think that's true. And there were a couple of occasions, there was a rocket strike, I think, on a ship that was unloading some munitions in one of the harbor in Tripoli that caused some Turkish casualties. You couldn't take too many of those because it is further away and it's not PKK related. So this was really about the maritime deal and about stabilizing the government. It's about the long-term training agreement between GNA and Turkey that gives Turkey a military foothold there and the opportunity to stabilize the Tripoli government. And it's also about access to Watia Air Base and to the port at Misrata. So these are geopolitical concerns. They're not visceral in the same way that the PKK is. So I agree with you. And yet I think the Turks knew this, and I think that their method of fighting that war, which relied on long-range strike and UAVs to a far greater extent. In Syria, they had ground-based artillery and they had commandos on the ground in greater numbers than they did in Libya. So, but by the way, that's a great point. If I can draw that out from the paper, is that this is a flexible and adaptive power projection network they've put together.
Okay, that's what I wanted to go to about what does this tell us about their national security strategy and how they're using force, how they're using hard power, not soft power, how they're using hard power to push forward their political agenda and their regional foreign policy.
Well, I think there's both a hard power and a soft power aspect to it. And one of the points I try to make in the paper, now hard power is a sine qua non. If you don't have that hard power, then you're not going to be able to influence outcomes. That said, the hard power itself rests upon a backbone that starts with diplomatic and commercial interests. The diplomatic backbone is representations, your consulates and your embassies. Turkey has more than doubled, I think it's actually tripled its diplomatic representations in Africa. It's had a vast expansion in its budget for diplomacy overseas. It's more than sextupled the amount of trade with Africa. And of course, this includes Libya, but not just that. So what happens is we see a pattern where the diplomatic engagement breeds commercial activity. The commercial activity breeds military cooperation. The military cooperation leads to institutional exchanges, and in some cases to defense industrial cooperation. And pretty soon what you have as a result of that is a network of access. And the access includes places in the Balkans, places in the Caucasus, places in North Africa and in the Gulf, as well as Central Asia. It's a pretty impressive network. And again, what we see is before there's ever an exercise of hard power at all, we see Turkish businesses go and they live among the people and engage with the people in ways that are more difficult for Westerners to do. We see Turkish trainers, and there's over 40 countries in which they've done this, that go to those countries and help to conduct training in their countries. We see students from those countries coming back to the Turkish war colleges and institutions. So we have a real people-to-people contact, commercial contact, diplomatic contact. All of that breeds access. And then with Turkey's sort of revolution in military technology, with the drones, but not just the drones. They've got satellites, they've got electronic warfare, they're developing indigenous aircraft, both rotary wing and now trying to work desperately on a fixed wing to replace the 5th generation fighter that they no longer have access to. But by any measure, it's been impressive. You put all of these things into a network combined with, perhaps most critically, the will to act and what we call learning by doing, right? There's a certain risk tolerance that you gain when you actually take a risk and it works. And then you, in some cases, like in Idlib, they did take a powerful hit back. Learning how to modulate your response to that is something that is a subtle tool of statecraft and one that takes learning to do. But once you've done it, the credibility of one's threats and the incentives for others not to get into a mutually coercive situation goes up. So that's a long-term positive second-order effect of the exercise of power projection that we saw last year.
So would you say, okay, so clear integration of soft power and hard power is going on and has been going on for quite some time. And again, one thing we do go back to again is 1974, because in 1974, in some ways, you could say that the US embargo on arms that followed really gave impetus to the Turkish arms industry. I mean, they learned the hard, just as the United States after the oil embargo in '73 learned, oh boy, we've got to really work on getting our own energy resources because we can't be beholden to OPEC.
And just as the Israelis learned after the '67 war, because the French had cut off resupply under Arab pressure, and at that time the AMX tanks and I believe Mirage fighters, all these other French systems and equipment that the Israelis used, all of a sudden became very difficult to get supply parts for as a result of Arab pressure upon the French. So what did that do? That spurred the development of the Merkava tank and Israeli aerospace industries and all the domestic arms production and technology production that Israel's got. And Turkey went through a fairly similar process after Cyprus and the embargo that followed from '74 to '80. So what we see now is a fairly mature, not fully independent. You know, there are some gaps like, you know, the heavy capacity tanks, engines for tanks and for the advanced fighters. There's still some things they can't quite get on their own, but in some of those areas, they're reaching out to countries like Ukraine and coming up with sort of cooperative programs there. So yeah, I think you're right. I think the lesson we should learn from that is that arms cooperation, defense industrial cooperation, is probably not best construed as a pressure point, at least not more than once, on the user. Because if once you've done that, once you've proven that I will cut off these sensitive items that you depend upon me for, I will cut them off in a time of need for you, then the only lesson that really comes through with that is that I must not be dependent on that source again. I've always believed that from a security cooperation perspective, the value of providing arms and training It's not that you can cut it off and jab somebody. It's that over a long period of time, there's a mutual learning that goes on. And when our soldiers study together and when you use our equipment, you study our doctrine, a commonality of approach and a commonality of philosophy emerges. And then that's when you have sort of the mind meld at the senior military level. That's really the benefit, other than making money for your defense industries. This idea that we can use it as a pressure point or a spigot to turn off and on is ultimately self-defeating.
Yeah, I mean, one of the realities which people need to confront, we are not the only country in the world that is making sophisticated military hardware. I mean, okay, and unless you can get all the other countries, now, fine, if you want to try to come up with a list of rogue nations that nobody should supply advanced defensive articles to, fine, we can do that. And it's probably going to be an incredibly short list. It might have North Korea on it. You might be able to get Nicaragua lately onto it, but you wouldn't have been able to get Nicaragua on the list 12 years ago. Yeah, I mean, your point's incredibly well made. I mean, it's exactly right. We have to be, you know, I kind of got started in doing political military affairs in the State Department because I was posted to a country that did not have a security assistance officer or a defense attaché. So as the political officer there, the ambassador said, "Oh, look, you have new job responsibilities." Well, one of the things, it was a small country, we had a small count, but we ran an IMET program, okay? Yep. And every year we were sending basically 5 or 6 of their best and brightest young officers off to the United States for a year of training. And then we brought them back. And then we were pretty good about tracking them. And over time, of course, what happened? Those 5 or 6, again, small military, small country, those 5 or 6 outstanding young officers progressed through and all moved up to senior rank. Yeah. And you maintain the contacts and all that. And that is, as you say, it is that long-term connections and building, which Turkey has been doing for 30 years. And they have been effectively combining commercial interest, cultural interest, actually tourism interest too. People forget that actually has incredible value. That's right. I'm not sure where Turkish Airlines doesn't fly to anymore. I think you can go from Istanbul. I think what is it? You can go from Istanbul to any city that has a population of 2 million or more. Direct.
That sounds about right.
It's just amazing. But so your prediction is this continues and intensifies, that the combination of soft power and hard power, the willingness, and let's focus on that word you used, will, the willingness for the current Turkish administration to use hard power in conjunction with soft power for its strategic interest is not going to abate. And I think this is an important point. You didn't say it directly, but what I'm hearing is, and it doesn't matter who happens to be the president of the moment, that this is really something that over the last 30 years has intensified and is likely to do so in the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think having gained possession of a power projection network, which is what I think of this as, and again, it's a layered network with diplomatic and commercial and intelligence and military and defense industrial layers, as well as the whole soft power Turkish soap opera effect. All of these things are glue that holds together. And by the way, some of the most desperate people in the world have been helped by Turks over the last 10 or 15 years. And by that, I mean the Somalis, I mean the Afghans, I mean the Qataris when they were under sort of the blockade by the rest of the GCC. There's been, and Ukraine under pressure from Russia, there's been a number of countries that in their moment of need, the Turks sort of went to the mat for, and either sold them defense equipment or came in to train their forces. Libya, another example. So they've got this network that's built to some extent on mutual interest, and some extent on shared experience, and some extent now on loyalty. That they're not going to let that go. But I think in some sense, the hardest part was to put that network together. And I think that the requirement for the application of military force will actually drop now, unless people are stupid enough to try to disassemble it by force. I don't see the Emirates, for instance, posing a direct military threat to Qatar. Not today, but I think that was a very real threat in 2018, or at least in 2017. I don't think that Haftar is going to try to attack Tripoli again. So now we may see big fighting in Syria if Assad tries to liquidate Idlib. But the bottom line is, I think the Turks will persist in defending their interests, if necessary, including kinetic means and hard power within this network, but they will prefer to try to just make the network work as a commercial and diplomatic entity. Now, what's most interesting to me is how, if this stabilizes somewhat, it might open some new avenues to resolve some of the others. So for instance, the long-running Israel-Turkish tensions. Now that we know that Turkey's sort of a player in Libya, a player in gas in the Eastern Med, and still interested in making deals, there's some space both on Palestinian issues and energy issues that may open up between the Turks and the Israelis. Egypt and Turkey obviously have some interests as well that they could resolve both. And by the way, there's been tacit cooperation between the two in Libya anyway. So I actually think that the kinetic actions of 2020 set the stage by restoring sort of a deterrence and a credibility to Turkish hard power, set the stage for more creative diplomacy.
So going off of your word diplomacy and also the fact that I'm looking at the clock, let me ask you this. Do the current diplomatic leadership of the US, do they understand this? Or do you think that in some ways, I mean, my greatest fear about the current diplomatic leadership of the United States and national security leadership is that they have been captured by people who are wedded to a particular ideological position, rather than saying, okay, what is in the greatest national interest of the United States, which I guess is a kind of realpolitik attitude, but I mean, that's what I think American diplomats are supposed to be doing. What's in the US best interest? So
I think that, and I sort of come from the other side of the aisle where I swing in my domestic politics than the current administration, but I'm going to give them credit for being fairly pragmatic to date in their approach to the Turks. And I would hold up as Exhibit A Victoria Nuland's testimony in this past week, in which she both criticized but also praised Turkey for some of the critical and constructive things that it has done in the broader Middle East and as part of NATO. I don't think there's a lot of love lost between people in the White House and the NSC and the Department of State, but I also think there's a certain pragmatism. I mean, we're not going to go solve Syria on our own, but we care about Syrian refugees and the humanitarian outcomes in Syria. And guess who holds the key to that to a certain extent? Well, the Russians get a vote for sure, but the Turks hosting 5 or 6 million Syrian refugees, and with the long border and the border crossings, is indispensable. And as we've seen with Afghanistan, also, if we're going to have any diplomatic presence in Kabul and a functioning airport, it's going to depend on the Turks assuming leadership for the security of those things and our support to them. And that's just two examples, but there's more. There's others. The multilateral diplomacy on Libya is very much indexed to the Turks, sort of helping to keep the military balance. So I think the new team understands that. I think the bigger problem is not so much with the administration, who will, in my view, play a very pragmatic game of not trying to fix the relationship with Turkey, but not trying to make it any worse. Right. The real problem is with Congress. And that's because in Congress, there's a Turkey fatigue. And the old US congressional, the US Turkey Congressional Caucus has atrophied somewhat, to put it mildly. Yeah. And I think that the low baseline of mutual trust stems a lot from that. So they've got a new ambassador, Merjan, who's doing a good job of reaching out both to Congress and to various constituencies in the US. We have newly designated, I say we, the president has newly designated a nominee for our ambassadorship in Ankara, Jeff Flake, which also gives some opportunities as a political appointee to have the ear of the president. We'll see if that gives, because Merjan is also a political appointee. So in both cases, we have some indication that this is going to be treated as a special case by the sending governments for these ambassadorships. I would hope that Congress will give some time for this relationship to get better. I think if we think back to the passage of the CATSA legislation under President Trump, the Congress was so frustrated and so desirous of forcing his hand on how he dealt with the Russians that they passed a law that had very binding effects that were deleterious to the U.S.-Turkish relationship. I'm hoping Congress is not going to do anything like that, either in terms of pressing for more vigorous enforcement of CATSA or coming up with new, more specific legislation that will shackle the administration's ability to make good deals and pragmatic deals with the Turks. Given that, I think I had real fears in the first 3 months or so that the new administration would be ideologically or reflexively anti-Turkey, but I'm less concerned about that now and more concerned about pragmatic management.
Well, I hope you're right. And one of the ways I've always looked at this is that let's just say that the kind of ideological rigidity is oftentimes personalized. In other words, there would be one or two characters from Turkey or from the US side who were seen as the devil incarnate or some Dracula type character.
I know that guy.
Right, exactly. But unfortunately that would translate into a relationship with the entire country. And was it Castlereagh, who was the British Prime Minister, who said, no nation has friends, it only has interest.
Yeah.
And again, you can take these great ideological positions, and defining what those national interests are is obviously the job of every administration. But I agree with you. The first couple months, I was really worried that the ideology was going to trump the pragmatism, and it looks now like the pragmatism is winning out. However, I am from New Jersey. One of my senators is Bob Menendez, and he has particular, let us say, he has many incentives among his constituents to bear a grudge against Turkey. So we'll see how that goes. He's also Bob Menendez hasn't lasted as long as he has in the U.S. Senate by being an ideologue. He's a pragmatic type of guy, although he does know when to say the right things to deflect.
Yeah, and for just one final comment on my paper, I didn't write it necessarily to change the mind of people who think that there's a serious chasm between U.S. and Turkish national interests, or who think that Turkey is headed in the path that's bad for the certain U.S. interest. I think that's fine. And if Senator Menendez and others believe that, that's not really my point. My point is have a fair appreciation for context. And people who make their calculations based on Turkish weakness or isolation are on a fool's errand. That's not where we're at. And in a world situation that's becoming much more multipolar, where we have some really bad actors like the Russians and the Iranians and the Chinese that are not just competitors of the United States, but actively working to undermine us, we need to think twice about how much of a threat a strong Turkey is. It's going to be a frustration. It is a strong Turkey, though. This is not a Turkey that's on the verge of collapse or isolation. So we need to think very carefully about where we can collaborate and maximize those opportunities commercially and geostrategically. And then we have to very carefully manage in those situations where we get into a tug of war or a coercive situation. So I would just want the Senator Menendez's of the world to keep in mind, by reading the report, a little of this context and modulate the approach, not necessarily the goals, but the approach with that in mind.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Rich. We are out of time. I'm going to hit a button and maybe we can chat for a little bit offline. But ladies and gentlemen, just tell you again, this was retired Colonel Rich Outzen, who is a geopolitical strategist and consultant to a number of people. I would encourage you to go back and read his article, which was at the Washington Institute. So just do Rich Outzen, Washington Institute. It was July 9th. And the title again is Drones. Go ahead.
Deals and National Will.
There you go. All right. Thanks a lot.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here, for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.